Morning. My name's Billy, if you haven't met me. I want to start this morning by bringing you into our living room for a bit. We have two recliner couches. Diesta sits on one, and I sit on the other. And the children sit when they want to join us around. So this is what happens in our house. It doesn't matter what we're watching when we're watching TV. It could be a hockey game, could be a documentary, could be a rom-com, could be something with a tender moment between a parent and a child, whatever it might be. And at some point, while I watch, I have my eyes on the screen, which is where the TV is and the action is. But sometime while I'm watching, I become aware that something else is happening in the room. Because the eyes of the rest of the people have started to move away from the television. They've started to drift away from the screen and they settle quietly on me. And then someone says, "Are you crying?" Usually that is followed by laughter because, yes, I am crying, and so is Terry. The national anthem gets me every time. A birth, animal or human, a death, a child running to see a parent, love that is recognized or restored, sometimes just something funny. And that's probably not a revelation to those of you who listen to me frequently. Last month, Jonathan and I went to a retreat in Texas, and this was my second time at this particular retreat. And both times, I have found that the solitary times of prayer involve something more than just my eyes leaking. They actually involve sobbing. This time I could feel it coming. I started to weep in the first lecture for no apparent reason. And yet I was still somewhat surprised by what happened next. I found myself out near the lake. It's in Texas, so it was warmer. I was out underneath the stars. And I think what happened next was I had not fully processed my grief surrounding Odell's death. And so the first night while I was out there by the lake, I finally let it go. And the next morning, same thing happened. I was supposed to be doing a prayer exercise, contemplating, what were we contemplating? We were contemplating Jesus calming the storm, and the storm in my eyes unleashed again. There's something that happens when you and I put ourselves in spaces where it's just me and God. And I want to encourage you to try that sometime, maybe this week. But I do want to warn you that being in a vulnerable space with God will very likely involve tears. I've been thinking about why we cry, why it happens, what it means. A couple thousand years ago, the Roman poet Virgil wrote a phrase that keeps coming up in our culture. It's on war memorials, it's on papal encyclicals, it's in a book by Richard Rohr. And just last month, U2 put out a new song. And it's this phrase, sunt lacrimae rerum. There are tears in things, or could be translated, the things themselves have tears. Either way, it means this: the world is not as it should be. And our tears are telling the truth about that. And there's a science to this, which I confirmed with my daughter, the optometrist, this week. There are 3 kinds of tears. But the third kind of tears is emotional tears, the kind that come from grief or beauty or love or loss. Those kind of tears are actually chemically distinct from every other kind of tear that we have. They carry stress hormones out of our body. In other words, tears are natural painkillers. Tears help the body process what we cannot carry alone. And research confirms something different that most of us have felt, that there's something that happens when we cry alone in the dark. It releases something. But when you and I cry in the presence of someone who stays with us and does not look away, something different happens. The body settles in a way it cannot settle alone. We are seen, and something in us knows it. A few weeks ago, I mentioned something my dad had said to me when I visited him. He said, "Life is a series of little deaths." And I keep coming back to that in this series because it names something important for us. It's that it's not just the big deaths, the big losses where we experience grief. In fact, every transition that we have involves loss. Every season that closes is a small grief. The end of something you loved, a version of yourself, perhaps, that you had to let go. This past week has been a pretty difficult week for me in terms of health, even at this moment. The continuing effects of my concussion are painful, and they're frustrating, and they're debilitating. But there's also grief. I've lost something small, perhaps, but important, with probably more to come. I likely won't ever play hockey again. It hurts. And if that's true for something as small as hockey, how much more it is for the losses that take our breath away. A grief researcher named Mary Lamia put it this way: grief for a significant loss doesn't end. It becomes part of how you continue to love the thing that you lost. The grief keeps showing up because the love you have does not stop. Nicholas Wolterstorff said it this way. He said, "The wound doesn't heal. The wound becomes part of who you are." Most of us, I think, have never been given permission or a form or company for any of this grief, which is why today I want to talk about tears. Tears not as a sign of weakness or a failure of faith, but as one of the most honest things that you and I as humans can do. And I want to suggest 3 things that tears can tell us. First, that tears tell us the truth about the world. Second, that in our tears we are not alone. And third, tears at their deepest are a defiant hope. So first, tears tell the truth about the world. In the beginning, before there was anything that went wrong, there was shalom. We usually translate it as peace, but of course it's much bigger and richer than that. Shalom means wholeness and fullness and right relationships in every direction between us and God, between us and each other, between us and the world. Picture, for example, a banquet where all of us has a place at the table. Everybody has what they need. The food's good. The company is real and interesting. The work that brought you there meant something. That's the picture we have in Genesis 1 and 2. A world where everything is in its right place. Everything is flourishing. Everything is held together by love. And as image bearers of God, we had our place at the table at the banquet. A friend and I were having a discussion this week, and he told me this phrase. He said, "We were made to be stewards of shalom, people who practice peace." And then comes Genesis 3, and shalom is shattered, and relationships in all directions are ripped apart. Death has come. You will return to the ground, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Death was not the plan. In fact, the Apostle Paul calls it the last enemy. All of our other losses are gathered up and ended by death. Every death, every graveside, every war, every starving child, every family that's torn apart. All of those deaths are a perversion of what was supposed to be whole. And so when I watch what is happening in Ukraine or Iran or various other places where death is wielded by pride, where there is careless disregard for human life, I feel the anger of the prophets, the anger we hear in the Psalms, the outrage of people who know that the world was made for something better than this. And that anger is not a failure of faith, it's the appropriate response of people who know that something is genuinely wrong. And that kind of anger often ends in tears. When we feel grief, it is not a weakness, it is an honest recognition of the gap between what is and what was supposed to be. Your tears are the part of you that still knows that the world was made for shalom. Now, how do we live with that anger, with that grief? How do we carry the weight of what death has done to the world we were made to tend? Part of the answer is that we have to feel it, not just think it. The Canadian psychologist Hilary McBride argues that we have learned to manage almost everything from the neck up, including grief. We analyze it, we describe it, we theologize about it, and all the while our bodies are carrying it, waiting to do the work the mind cannot do alone. See, knowing about a loss is not the same as feeling a loss. Grief is not primarily a thought that we have, it is something that lives in the body. And tears are not just emotional expression, they're the body's mechanism for processing what the mind has often been holding at arm's length. For some of us, that looks like tears, but for others, it's that tightness you feel in your chest that finally releases, the exhaustion that comes when you stop holding yourself together, the moment you sit down and you let the weight just land. All of those are the body doing what it needs to do. Francis Weller has spent his career studying grief, and he argues that grief is far more prevalent than we recognize. He describes 5 gates through which grief enters a human life. The first gate is the one that we all know, that is, that everything that we love, we will eventually lose. Grief is the cost of loving. Every person, every animal, every place we cherish will one day be lost to us. The second gate is the places in you and I that have never known love, the parts of ourselves that have been never touched by warmth or welcome, the parts of us that were denied or abandoned or forgotten. The third gate he calls the sorrows of the world, the suffering that you and I witness and we cannot fix. Forests burning and oceans rising, children in hunger. The fourth gate is what we expected but we did not receive. You know these. The life we thought we would have. The love that was promised but was withheld. And the fifth gate he calls ancestral grief, the losses of those who came before us, what we might call family wounds. You feel any of those? On any given Sunday, in a room like this, almost everyone is grieving something. We live in a culture that has decided that tears are symptoms of weakness. And so we teach it to our children really early, don't we? Big boys don't cry. But then big girls don't cry either. And we call it strength to not cry. But is it? The person who cannot weep is not stronger than the people who can, because we were made to grieve. And grief is not an imposition on the dead. Grief is something that belongs to us as the living. A funeral is not for the dead. It's for the living. And tears have always been part of how human beings mark the significant moments, not just deaths, but births and weddings and baptisms and graduations. Any moment where something begins or something ends. The tears of both pain and joy are the body's acknowledgement that this thing in front of us matters, that something real happened, that we are not merely moving from one item on the calendar to the next. And so when we lose those rituals, we lose the containers that make the work of grief possible. And people end up carrying grief with nowhere to put it. No marker, no acknowledged ending, no community gathered to stay together that this person was real, this person mattered, this loss is real, and to say we will not pretend that is otherwise. Tears tell the truth about the world. In a culture that has largely forgotten how to weep, the person who grieves honestly is the person who is paying attention. And as it turns out, there's one who's been paying attention all along. Jesus had a friend. His name was Lazarus. It was someone the Bible describes Jesus as loving. And Lazarus was sick. In fact, his sisters were convinced that he was going to die. And yet, Jesus did nothing. He waited for 2 days before he started to walk toward the tomb of his friend, away from safety and toward death. And Thomas said, as they started the journey, "Let's go and walk with him, and let us die with him." And as Jesus walks towards the tomb of his friend, his other friend, Martha, the sister of Lazarus, meets him on the road. And she says, "Lord, if you would have been here, he would not have died." But even now. And she turns and walks with him. And Jesus continues to walk toward the tomb of his friend. And then he meets the other sister, Mary, who it says comes towards him and collapses. "Lord, if you would have been here, he would not have died." And then the crowd, it says, collapses along with her. And they wail. Jesus, who knows exactly what he is about to do, stops literally in his tracks. Something tightens in his jaw, in his chest, in his hands. This is wrong. Death is wrong. It should not be here. It should not have this kind of power over the people that he loves. And then, while the crowd wails around him, Jesus quietly lets the tears flow. Jesus wept. The creator of Shalom, standing at the place where Shalom has been most completely broken, weeps. And the crowd says, "See how he loved him." But there are others in the crowd who say, "If he had been there, he would not have died." Jesus wept. And there on the road, still outside the village, Jesus asks the question that takes him the rest of the way. "Where have you laid him?" And then he turns again toward the tomb. Brian Zahnd describes grief as wounded love. Where there is no love, there can be no grief. The devil doesn't grieve. Indifference doesn't grieve, but God grieves. Jesus wept at that tomb because he loved Lazarus, and grief is what love looks like when it meets death. The gut-level response that is described for Jesus is love confronting its ultimate enemy. The tears that Jesus wept were wounded love. You and I know this, but loving is inherently risky. The moment that you say yes to a friendship or to a marriage, you consent to the possibility and the inevitability of grief. The moment you make the decision to have a child, you make yourself vulnerable to losses that you cannot imagine. Every significant yes to love is also a yes to the possibility of tears, which is why many of us have chosen the opposite direction, to keep our emotional distance from deep friendships, from community, even from God. If you don't love too deeply, you won't grieve deeply. But you and I, as stewards of shalom, were not made to tend the world from behind glass. Mark Buchanan was writing an article about this passage when a robin hit the window and died. It stopped him from writing anymore, and so he went outside and he took a hold of the robin, and he took it back to the backyard, and he dug a hole, and he put the robin in it, covered it over with earth. He was walking back from that through the yard when a huge sadness swept over him, and he wrote these lines: "This is a world where robins die, and sparrows, and people, the ones we love, the ones Jesus loves, all of them. And they fall to the ground, and they are enfolded into the earth. And most times, Jesus doesn't come to raise them up, not in our lifetime, not so that we can see." Jesus wept. Twice in my life, I have been in a hospital room with parents with babies. One baby was stillborn. The other baby would die within a couple days. Both times, there was nothing to say. There were no words for that room. It was quiet. What I could do was stay, and so I stayed. And I held the babies. And I think that presence in those moments, in the worst moments of our lives, is what the incarnation of Jesus really means, what it's about. God does not send a message to our tombs. He comes to our tombs in a body, and he weeps. And when you stand at your particular tomb or in the house that's too quiet, or you wake at 3 a.m, you are not alone in it. The God who wept at a tomb is with you in yours, not watching from a distance, but in it. In our tears, we are not alone. And because God is in the grief with us, we can bring it to him. Tears do not have to be sealed inside us and should not be sealed inside of us. N.T. Wright says that lament is a protest of hope. Jesus' grief at the tomb of Lazarus was defiant. And the choice to keep living when it might be easier to just accept death, to keep loving, to keep hoping, to keep bringing grief to God, that's defiant too. Hope is defiant because it refuses to concede the enemy's claim that death is final. And this is what the lament psalms give us permission to do, to bring the full weight of our grief and our pain and our loss and our anger and whatever else directly to God. God, this is not what your world is supposed to look like. How long will you wait? How long will this in-between time last before you make things right again? That's not a failure of faith. That is faith in its most honest form. Because you only protest what you believe can and should be different. Henry Nouwen wrote that much of prayer is grieving, and that this grief runs so deep not because human sin is so great, but because God's love is so vast and so real. Grief in prayer is not the grief of guilt, it's the grief of love, feeling the full weight of what we have lost. The grief that we bring honestly to God, that is lament. We carry an expectation that grief should move through a predictable sequence towards resolution. We've heard of these stages that you should move through denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance in order. But those stages were never meant to be a schedule. You don't graduate from one to the next and then arrive at acceptance on somebody's timeline. The experience of grief is more like cycles. You revisit them. You have a good day and then a bad day. That's not failure, that's just how grief works. But grief that is carried alone tends to go underground. It has nowhere to go. But grief that is witnessed, grief that is seen and that is held by others, it moves. And the movement of grief is not a straight line. Researchers will say it oscillates. You go into the loss and then back out into daily life and then back in again and then back out. But while we do that, there is a resilience that God has built in us to do that, which is where I think the rest of us, the community of believers, can help. We don't fix the grief of others or put a timeline on it, but we stay with it. We show up at the funeral. We say the name of the person who died, even if it's 6 months later or a year later, when everyone else has moved on. And we ask not just, how are you doing, but I've been thinking about him this week. That specificity is what tells someone that their grief is witnessed, that the person who died is still real to someone else. And this is hard work, but it's one of the most important things that we can do as a community. And this is our commitment as a church, that we choose to walk each other home, that we choose to be a place where we can help each other not just to die well, but also to grieve well. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn." Present tense, no time limit to it. But comfort is coming in the future, not yet, still on its way. And while you and I wait, our tears are defiant hope that that future will happen. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4, "Brothers and sisters, we don't want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope." Grieve and cry, but not as those without hope. See, Paul assumed that grief would happen, that it is natural, that it is needed. He doesn't say don't grieve because he expects it. The tears are real. The enemy of death is real. The losses we face are real. But hope is also real. The story is not over and mourning is coming. Tears tell the truth about our world, that shalom was broken, that death is the enemy, that we were made for something better than this. But in our tears, we are not alone, because the creator of shalom stood at a tomb and wept. Grief is wounded love, and Jesus is in it with you and not watching from a distance. And tears are a defiant hope. Hope that we aim at the God who can act in a story that is not finished, toward the day where every tear will be wiped away and death itself will be destroyed. This morning you are held by God and also by us. You have value. You have something to give if you are grieving, maybe especially in the sharing and witnessing of your grief. And you are not for a single moment alone in it. And so before we close, I want to give you 3 invitations for this week. You can take one, you can take all of them, it's up to you. First of all, I would invite you to think of a loss that never got named. It doesn't have to be a death. It might be something that just ended without ceremony, like a friendship that just dissolved. A version of yourself that you had in your mind that you had to let go. Maybe a relationship that stayed broken until it was too late to repair it. A door that's been closed, a word that has been never spoken. Something that you're still carrying that has had no grave, no funeral, no acknowledged ending. I want to encourage you to name it this week. In whatever privacy feels right, whether it's in your journal, in a quiet room, maybe a walk, name that grief out loud before God. Say what it was. Say what it cost you. Grieve it. Even or especially if there's nothing to fix and no way to resolve it. And then, maybe just as an act of will, if not the feeling that follows, forgive that thing or that person. And then forgive yourself. Because those losses that we don't grieve matter, but we don't need to carry them forever. Second, I want you to give yourself permission not just to grieve, but to keep living. Not to move on, that's not what I mean. Moving on suggests you leave a person or a loss behind, and you don't have to do that. But I want to encourage you to bend toward the morning, to allow yourself to have a good day, a moment of joy, a return to ordinary life. That's not a betrayal of your loss. It's what God built into you. It's resilience, where grief and living go together, and you're allowed to do both. And then finally, I'd encourage you to write a lament. Not a prayer that begins with praise and works its way to the hard thing. I'm suggesting you just start with the hard thing. Just address God directly and say, God, this is wrong. Name the loss, the anger, the confusion, the question you have that has no answer. Say the thing that you've been too polite or too frightened to say. The lament psalms give us permission as an ancient and honored form of prayer because God can handle this. It's not like he hasn't heard what you have to say before. He has felt the pain himself and he has entered into it on purpose. You are made in the image of a God who also weeps, who stood at a tomb and felt the wrongness of it deep in his gut. A God who loved himself without protecting himself from the cost of that love, who grieves with you because he is love. Your tears and my tears are not weakness. They are part of the image of God in you, functioning exactly as you were designed. And you are not, for a single moment, alone in them.